The Urbanist is brought to you in association with the Department of Culture and Tourism, Abu Dhabi. Saadiyat Cultural District Abu Dhabi is a beacon of hope and inspiration. A catalyst to spark growth and collaboration with museums and experiences, where art and science and nature and technology coexist.
The belief of Abu Dhabi that culture is the backbone of our society.
Stay tuned for a special episode of the show, in which you can hear His Excellency Mohammed Khalifa Al Mubarak explain exactly why and how Saadiyat Cultural District Abu Dhabi is the perfect place to collaborate, create and innovate. Saadiyat Cultural District Abu Dhabi, proud partner of The Urbanist on Monocle Radio.
The Defence Ministry buildings in Belgrade are a landmark in Serbia's capital, but they stand out because of their state of dilapidation. They were hit by NATO airstrikes 25 years ago, and they've remained in their devastated condition ever since. Now, an agreement for reconstruction on the site is causing outrage, not least because it involves Donald Trump's son-in-law. You're listening to Tall Stories, a Monocle production brought to you by the team behind The Urbanist. I'm Andrew Tuck. In this episode, Monocle's man in the Balkans, Guy de Launey, reviews what is next for this notable site.
Nothing says welcome like a bombed-out building. That's been Serbia's philosophy since 1999, when NATO airstrikes hit the Ministry of Defence complex in Belgrade. On my first visit to the city in 2012, the transfer from Nikola Tesla Airport took me along Kneza Miloša Street. It was once the city's main promenade. These days, it's somewhat choked with 6 lanes of traffic and haunted by the ghosts of a turbulent recent history. As we trundled along, I took in my surroundings. On my left was the US Embassy, torched by the proverbial angry mob in 2008, when Kosovo unilaterally declared its independence. A little further along, there was the park behind the main government building, where Prime Minister Zoran Đinđić was assassinated 5 years earlier. And on my right, like a smile with a row of broken teeth, the shattered remains of the Ministry of Defence complex. If nothing else, it certainly raised the eyebrows. How many European capitals with the wherewithal to do something about it would allow a bomb site to scar their city's main boulevard? Even Bosnia's capital, Sarajevo, prioritised reconstruction after its ruinous 4-year siege in the 1990s. But for a quarter of a century, Serbia and Belgrade have taken a different approach. The fate of the Ministry of Defence complex reflects an ongoing narrative about the events of 1999 and the way the country sees itself. It didn't start off that way. The buildings date back to the 1960s, when Tito's Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia was in its pomp. It had emerged from the Second World War as one of the good guys. Its heroic partisan resistance beat back the Nazi occupiers, supporting and supported by the Allies. The Ministry of Defence complex reflected that status. Architect Nikola Dobrović designed the buildings to resemble a canyon in the Sutjeska River. That was where the partisans had held out under a fierce Nazi assault and shifted the course of the Second World War in Yugoslavia. To reflect that, Dobrović created 2 structures on either side of Nemanjina Street. The tiered buildings were constructed in an eye-catching contrast of reddish-brown stone and white marble slabs. Viewed together, they took the form of a gate, welcoming visitors to the city coming up the hill from Belgrade's main railway station. They carried on doing that after the 1999 airstrikes, but their altered appearance carried a completely different message to the one intended by Dobrović and Tito in the 1960s. This was no longer one of the triumphant good guys prospering and heading in the right direction. Now, Serbia was hurt, confused, and unsure of which way it should turn. The bombing was part of the campaign against Serbia's then-president Slobodan Milošević as his troops persecuted ethnic Albanians in Kosovo. To this day, NATO and its member states portray the attacks as regrettable but righteous. That's very much a minority view in Serbia. Here, most people view the airstrikes as an illegal assault with many civilians among the casualties. Keeping the Defence Ministry buildings in place was an act of defiance. They stood as a memorial to the victims of the airstrikes. One of the buildings was completely uninhabitable, but part of the other was still functioning as offices a couple of years into my time in Belgrade. I paid a visit in the agreeable company of Major Jovan Krivokapic. He gave me a guided tour and explained that the structure was deteriorating. Something needed to be done. In the past few years, there has been some limited demolition and structural work to stabilise the buildings, but now it seems the government has decided to make a more radical change. It's agreed a contract with a company called Affinity Global to redevelop the site, and this is causing all sorts of kerfuffle, not just because Affinity Global is an American company, but because its founder is Jared Kushner, best known as Donald Trump's son-in-law. In some ways, the decision isn't surprising. Before he became president in 2016, Donald Trump himself made it clear he was interested in building a hotel on the site, and opposition movements in Serbia have long accused the government of allowing foreign investors to profit from public property. They cite, as a prime example, the Belgrade waterfront project, constructed by Emirati developers on land owned by Serbia's railways. The protests are already underway. Architects bemoan the lack of consultation and the impending erasure of Yugoslav architectural heritage, and opposition movements are planning to replicate the Don't Drown Belgrade protests, which ultimately did nothing to stop the Belgrade waterfront development. Details about Jared Kushner's plans for the Defence Ministry buildings are thin on the ground. A hotel is in the offing, but there's also a twist. The contract insists that a memorial dedicated to all the victims of NATO aggression must form part of the development. That could be awkward if Kushner's father-in-law once again finds himself in the White House.
Tall Stories is a Monocle production from the team behind The Urbanist. This episode was written by Guy Launey and produced and edited by David Stevens. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast to receive new episodes every week. I'm Andrew Tuck. Goodbye, and thank you for listening, City Lovers.